Well, hello again, and good day, brothers and sisters in scouting. This video is along the road toward the completion of night requirements for BPSA traditional scouting. And in this video, I'm going to discuss my experience reading two of Lord Robert Baden-Powell's early books on scouting. The first one being Scouting for Boys, which he wrote in 1908 and virtually founded the worldwide scouting movement. And that was followed up in 1922 by the second book I'm going to discuss today, which is Rovering for Success, written for older or senior scouts, young adults, after World War I. And it was a few years after the Rover movement had been started, but he was clarifying his guidelines and recommendations there. So I'd like to start out with the first book, Scouting for Boys. This is a virtual or electronic version of the book, trying to conserve our world by not wasting paper. So we've got an original version of the 1908 book here, written by Lord Baden-Powell himself. And this book was written after he had already written a previous book on scouting that was really intended more for adults. After his experiences as an officer in various military campaigns for the British Empire, especially in Africa, and he wrote that book, and it really had an unanticipated success with young boys and with people that wanted to create programming for young boys. There was at the time also a back to nature movement going on in Western countries like the United States and Great Britain, where people generally wanted to reconnect with nature and have outdoor experiences. So the book, his original scouting book, really had, again, a lot more interest and enthusiasm for it than he realized. And when he realized that, he went ahead and wrote the book in 1908, Scouting for Boys. In that book, he outlines several things. Really, he's designing an outdoor scouting program for boys. And so he talks about a combination of things, including hard skills that boys could or should learn as part of a traditional scouting program, in terms of outdoor type skills, working with camping, working with hiking, working with outdoor cooking, working with things like pioneering and maps, and which is orienteering. Pioneering would be the construction of large devices with logs and sticks and ropes. And games. He talks a lot about games in there, because games, as he knows, and as child psychologists and educators and those who work with young children know, that games are a primary way that young people learn, but also develop social skills and communication skills. And so games are built throughout. Another thing he talks quite a bit about is citizenship and the role of the boy in the community as he learns leadership skills and becomes an older boy and is preparing to take on a meaningful role in society. So the way that the book is structured is in 26 what he calls campfire yarns, or campfire stories that are designed to be shared, individually with a group of boys, maybe sitting around a campfire setting when they're in more of a receptive mood for instruction or education. They're told in a very conversational, relaxed way. So it's not like reading an academic textbook. It almost is like sitting down and listening to a older, wiser man share his wisdom and experience. And there are plenty of personal stories that he shares from his journey again, as an officer in the military, traveling all over the world and having campaigns. There's military stories about him surviving attacks or succeeding against his enemies. There's also hunting stories in there about him hunting large game, and of course those stories are meant to increase and engage the boys' interest, and maybe even be shared, with groups of boys by other scouting adult leaders to educate them as well as to capture their excitement and interest. So 26 yarns. Some of the yarns are called The Work of Scouts, What Scouts Do, Becoming a Scout, Scout Patrols. This is the formation and kind of outline of the patrol method and the way that scouting groups should be organized. Then he moves into life out in the open, sea and air scouting, signals and commands. He talks about pioneering, camping, and cooking, as I mentioned. Then he gets more into signs, what he calls sporing and reading signs. As far as woodcraft goes, a lot of people might hear that term woodcraft because that was the original idea of what scouting was. And many people might think that means working with saws or working with hammers or working with, cutting tools. Not so much. I mean, that can be included in there, of course, because you need to, use tools in order to, to make things or to camp or to, construct. But his idea in this chapter on woodcraft is really about stalking and animals and plants. It's really about engaging with nature in a very practical way to understand nature and be able to survive and thrive in nature. Keeping in mind that this was written over 100 years ago, back when a lot more people lived much more closely to nature and didn't have all the technology and instruments that we had today. And so learning how to use certain plants and, unfortunately hunt and use certain animals for primarily food was important instruction at that time. Also, then he has chapters on endurance, where he talks about growing strong, health-giving habits, and prevention of disease, which is very important for young men to learn, as well as another chapter on chivalry, where he talks again here about kind of building character and treating others well, establishing kind of a golden rule of behavior, and the importance of self-discipline and self-improvement, as well as helping and serving others, so that the boy is not just learning how to have fun or do things that he enjoys, but also inculcating in the young boy this attitude of service, and that he is there to improve himself to be the healthiest, most effective servant that he can be to improve society. And then a later section on saving life, where he talks about accidents, preparing for accidents, how to deal with accidents, and more again about helping others, especially in that context. And a final chapter on duties as citizens, initially talking about citizenship in the country, but then later in 1939, as he had again witnessed World War I, and then World War II had already started. This was very late in his life, only a few years before his death. He added a chapter on the importance of worldwide scouting, and especially the Jamboree movement. Baden-Powell was the founder of World Jamborees, the first one being in, I believe, Great Britain back in, 1930, I think. But he really had an avid interest in developing world scouting and world understanding, and appreciating different cultures and different ways of different religions, different languages, and different races. And he wanted people to get together and really achieve world peace. He even talked frustratingly about the failure of the scouting movement to secure world peace by preventing world wars. I think he was really disappointed that World War II was happening in the late 1930s, and was very avid about the scouting movement continuing to have world jamborees to promote world culture and understanding, and ultimately world peace. So that's the Scouting for Boys book. Rovering for Success, there's indications that Rovering began in the late teens, about 10 years after the Scouting movement developed. It was a program that was really the initial program for senior scouts or scouts over the ages of 15 or 16, who really have in some ways different developmental needs and interests than younger boys in the 11 or 12, 13, age group. And he saw the need for an older program that had more to do with outdoors, wilderness challenges, longer trips in the outdoors, and more about leadership development, not only leaders for the younger scouts, but leaders for society, and then also again preparing these young men for important roles in society. And this was again during the time World War I was happening, and the scouts played an active role in providing support for the community during that time. They weren't exactly, well, some of them actually did. Many of them did get recruited into the war, which is a great disappointment for Baden-Powell, which I believe was one of the reasons he wrote Rovering for Success after the war, to kind of give boys direction and purpose other than becoming, military fodder for armies. He wanted scouting to be more than that, and he was emphasizing with Rovering to Success that scouting was more about preparation for life than it was about preparation for being an Army soldier or Navy soldier or officer. Rovering for Success, again, was written in 1922, and it was divided up into a handful of sections. The large majority of the book actually doesn't say much at all about rovering. Rovering is really the last chapter in the book, where he specifically gives recommendations about how to organize rovering units, and what kind of activities that rovers would enjoy. At that time, he was conceiving of rovers as young adults, typically over 16 or 17 into maybe their 20s. He wasn't really conceiving of rovers as BPSA does today, fortunately, as a lifelong, organizational participation, though that came later. And again, the first maybe 80% of the book is dedicated to advising young men on how to live a meaningful and purposeful life. The first section has to do with, he starts off by talking about the importance of paddling your own canoe, as he calls it, which means setting your own direction, having independence and your own moral sense, your own moral compass, your own sense of conscience, and he kind of defines happiness in the beginning of the book as a life of service. And that's a theme that continues to present itself throughout the book. He wants to convince young men, that really life is not about pursuing, wealth or power or fame or pleasure. Those things can happen, but it's more about service and making the world a better place. And that people that get toward the end of their lives and haven't done that and really have focused on, those other things, pleasure, power, whatever, wealth, are not really happy. And so he proceeds to talk about different sections. The first one he calls horses, which is really about gambling and wasting one's money on idle pursuits, like a lot of young men tend to do, and how important it is to be more financially responsible, fiscally responsible, saving up your money, paying off your debts, preparing to be a husband and father, and again, a meaningful contributor to society, not someone who's taking away from society or not contributing to anything but his own gain. He then shifts to talking about wine, which is another kind of vice of young men to get addicted to various things like drinking or smoking, which he talks about at length and how important it is to be moderate in one's use of these things. I think he says something like, one drink is perfect, 2 drinks is too much, and 3 drinks you're already gone, meaning that you're wide open to basically be drunk or be manipulated and say and do things that you might regret or would get you in trouble. So he's really talking there about moderation and self-control and self-discipline. Building on some of the concepts he created in scouting for boys, for younger boys, but now really addressing kind of the behaviors and scenarios that young men would really encounter. The next chapter appropriately is on women. And he talks about, again, not just seeking pleasure and sexual relationships for the purpose of fun and amusement, but actually looking for serious relationships with high quality, women of high quality, who are more like marriage and family types rather than, prostitutes or what he might consider, loose women. Some of the concepts here are dated, and there is a bit of sexism here relative to the time. This is a time when women still didn't have, were just now beginning to get the vote, and were not part of the Boy Scouting movement directly. They were in the Girl Guides movement, which he also helped found, and his wife eventually became one of the leaders of that movement. But yeah, Baden-Powell had some pretty stiff ideas about women and difficulties, I would say, in his relationships with women, starting with his controlling mother. I think his father passed away when he was younger, and his mother was fairly controlling, and they had some conflict between them. And, for example, Baden-Powell was very adamant that women not be leaders in the Boy Scouting movement. Particularly with rovers. And that's, maybe you might call that sexism of the day, but I think it also reflects some of his conflicts and issues with his own mother. And he kind of redefines manliness as a man who takes responsibility and treats women with respect and, is more of a family man than a carouser. His next section is on cuckoos, where he's really talking about avoiding being swept up by some talented speaker or philosopher who's going to kind of bring unconventional or captivating ideas in and sort of sweep the man's mind away. Keep him from being sensible and from being in the mainstream. There were a lot of religious movements and healing movements around that time that many considered, quackery or kind of crazy, just guru type, one man founding a movement and people going off and creating colonies and giving up their whole lives to go off and follow. And he was trying to kind of advise against that. That again, a young man learns to paddle his own canoe and not be overly influenced by the thinking of any other man or group. And along that lines, he talks about irreligion following that, so that people shouldn't get swept up, young men shouldn't get swept up in any particular religion, and realize that different people have different religions, and it's important to keep it in perspective and respect each other. So that, again, we avoid these kinds of wars that are based on conflicts between people who are maybe a little bit too narrow in their and fanatic in their religious or philosophical views. And really, at that point, he transitions into talking about rovering, the organization of rovers, the rules for rovers. He reiterates the scout law, talks about different badges that can be earned and things like that. So it's interesting to go back 100 years and see what Baden-Powell's views were originally about rovering and how they've evolved. For example, that in 1970, BPSA was founded in Great Britain, and included rovers of all ages, and has been that traditionally since, which I'm grateful for, because as a man in my mid-50s, rediscovering scouting and especially rovering, I'm really grateful to be able to be a part of this organization and to feel like I'm an actual scout again rather than just a leader of scouts. Not that that's not a good thing, because I believe I've been living the principles of scouting and rovering my whole adult life, but now just really more directly and giving it more credit, and obviously manifesting it as a living, breathing scout to this day. So I want to thank you for sharing these moments with me. I hope that it was beneficial for you to learn my experience of reading these books. One thought I had after reading these books was, I can't believe that I was a Boy Scout for essentially, well, including Cub Scouting. I guess I was a scout for about 12 years, and I had never read anything that Baden-Powell had written, and really didn't even know much about him or his existence. And I think that's pretty sad. And similar to my experience of being raised Catholic for 20 years and virtually almost never having read the Bible. So it's like, kind of like, why, how can I be a scout and not have read the original works or ideas of the founder, who was very much a part of scouting for its first 30 years until he passed. I strongly recommend that everyone, boys, girls, young boys and girls, young adult girls and boys, and young adult and adult leaders of both genders of any age, read these books. I don't think that just because the books were written for boys and young men that they're irrelevant for girls. I certainly think that there are equivalent books written for girls around that time period that started the Girl Scouting movement that might be just as interesting or even more so for girls and young women to read. But I also don't think that these books should automatically be ignored by girls and women because they were written for boys and men. Many of the concepts in here are relevant for both genders and could and should be used as a foundation for scouting programs today. I really wish that the BSA movement had stuck more closely to some of these concepts, and I guess that's why BPSA evolved and exists today. So I'm glad to be a member again of this traditional scouting organization. I'm grateful to have read these books. I encourage you all to read them, and look forward to continuing my scouting journey with you all as I make my way to Rover Knight. Thank you again for your time, and best to you in scouting.